Good morning, Justice Chin.
Good morning.
I was wondering if you'd be willing to share some of the stories from your background and your upbringing to begin.
I was born and raised in Klamath Falls, Oregon. My parents were Chinese immigrants from a small village south of Canton. My father immigrated when he was 18. He came without family, without funds, and without language. And yet in this wonderful land of opportunity, he was able to carve out a remarkable life for his family. I am the youngest of 8 children. I have 4 brothers and 3 sisters. My brothers and sisters' names are George, Joe, Mary, Betty, Jack, Jeannie, and Tom. I have no idea where Ming came from.
And your dad came when he was 18. What about your mother?
My father went back to marry my mother. He went back to his village. She was the bride that was selected for him by his mother. He went back in 1917 to the village. A friend of his sewed gold coins into his jacket to take home to his family. It wasn't until 1924 that he was able to send for my mother.
And so when she arrived in 1924, how did she find her first experience in the United States?
She was incarcerated at Angel Island. She hardly ever talked about that experience, but we know it was traumatic for her because one evening she walked into the bathroom and one of the other ladies who was incarcerated had hung herself. It was an awful, awful experience, and she had to stay there for 6 weeks.
And so if she came in 1924, she entered when the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in place. And was that the reason that she had to spend 6 weeks at Angel Island?
They went through this entire examination to figure out whether or not she was really married, whether or not she was really married to my father, asking her about the rooms in the house where she grew up. And I eventually got the file, and there were drawings in the file made by the interrogators. So she had to go through that interrogation for 6 weeks. It was an eye-opening experience as to how our predecessors went through terrible times because of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
You know, I've heard some commenters talk today about the rise of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment that we were experiencing now, but you know, we've experienced that before. I wonder if the experience of your mother or your father, help. Whether you have any thoughts about the current climate.
Well, we always have to be aware of the history and what our parents had to go through. But I think it helps us, it helps inform us about how people ought to be treated. And we as judges have to be particularly mindful that everyone who comes into our courtroom should be treated with dignity and respect. So having this history in my background makes me even more cautious about how people are treated.
When your father came when he was 18, he first arrived in California, is that right?
Yes.
And then at some point he moved to Oregon and wound up in Klamath Falls.
Yes, he went from Stockton to Fallon, Nevada, to Alturas, California. When he was in Alturas, my mother ran a Chinese restaurant. She kept the profits from that restaurant in a coffee can in the kitchen. My father heard that the land in the Klamath Basin was rich and fertile, and he wasn't doing all that well farming in Alturas. So he went to Klamath Falls, borrowed 50 acres of fertile land, and was one of the first to grow potatoes in the Klamath Basin. My mother continued to run the restaurant in Alturas. Dad grew the first crop in Klamath Falls, and to hear every time he told the story, the potatoes started out about this size and grew and grew. It was like a fish story, but it was an overwhelming success. And he counted up the money of the profits for that first crop, and he came to my mother and said, "I'm sorry, we don't have enough money to buy the land, so we'll have to wait until next year." So my mother went to the coffee can and poured the contents onto the table, and my father counted it up and said, "It's enough, we can buy the land." And that's how they got their start in the Klamath Basin. And each year thereafter, they bought the land surrounding it. By the time my father passed away, they had accumulated 800 acres.
Wow. And so it really was your mother's coffee can money from her Chinese restaurant that bought the first plot of land.
That's how they were able to get their start.
And so did the entire family move up to Klamath Falls at that point?
Yes, but I wasn't born yet. So the four youngest were born in Klamath Falls.
And did your mother continue her work when she moved to Klamath Falls?
She worked on the farm. We all worked on the farm. We worked from sunup to sundown, 7 days a week. There was no such thing as Sundays off. There was no such thing as weekends.
Or labor laws, apparently. And how was, so really you were born and grew up on the farm?
Yes, but when it was time to go to school, my father had accumulated some funds, so he heard about a private Catholic boarding school in Klamath Falls. So he sent the three youngest of us to Sacred Heart Academy, and all three of us boarded.
So for the three youngest of the family that went to Sacred Heart Academy, in some respects you were firsts.
Yes, we were the only Asians in the school.
Probably ever.
Probably ever, but certainly while we were there.
Were there any other Asian families in Klamath Falls?
There was a Chinese restaurant.
And did you know the owners of that restaurant?
Oh yes, we spent a lot of time there.
And how old were you when you first went to Sacred Heart Academy?
6, first grade.
And then at some point you left Klamath Falls and you wound up going to high school, I believe, in the Bay Area.
That's true, but I have to tell you a step in between because it's an important piece of what led me to the law. when I got to junior high school, grade 7 and 8, the Sisters of St. Francis decided that they'd had quite enough of the Chin family, so they stopped boarding. There was a judge in town whose children also attended Sacred Heart. They were not boarders, they were day students, but the judge heard that the sisters were stopping boarding, so he called my father and said, "Sam, why don't you have Ming come and live with us for the last 2 years of junior high school?" So I did that. I went to live with Judge David Vandenberg, and it was the process that really tweaked my interest in becoming a lawyer. The judge gave me law books to read. He took me down to court. I got to watch jury trials. He handed me the gun in a murder case. He gave me Blackstone to read when I was 11. It's kind of amazing that I ever became a lawyer, but it was a great experience. By the time I graduated from USF, I decided that I wanted to go to law school, and I got a letter of recommendation from Judge Vandenberg. I still have that letter in the picture over in the corner of my chambers, which is a picture that the judge gave me, an autograph for me, and I kept that letter of recommendation behind his picture. Now, when I finished junior high school, that led me to another boarding school, and that was recommended to my father by a state senator in Oregon who sent his son to Bellarmine College Preparatory in San Jose. So both my older brother Tom and I were sent to Bellarmine for high school.
And so when Judge Vandenberg made that offer for you to stay and live with him, in some respects you really got a hands-on experience in the law. You were handed a copy of Blackstone and somehow still decided that you were interested in the law. And you watched a jury trial, you even handed a gun in a murder case. What was it about that experience that sparked your interest?
It was amazing to me that people would come into a courtroom to settle their differences rather than gunfights on the street or brawls that families got involved in. They would actually come into court to try to resolve their disputes, and that was what really attracted me to the law. I thought that the law was a setting where all individuals with whatever problem could come in and the court would help them get it resolved. And I certainly found that to be the case when I became a judge.
And at some point, your father had the opportunity to talk to a state senator in Oregon who recommended Bellarmine.
Yes.
Okay. So your father, for a first-generation immigrant, wound up being quite well connected to talk to politicians who could recommend things like that.
Oh, for his 60th birthday party, he had the judge at his party, he had the state senator at his party, he had the 2 mayors of the cities surrounding the farm. He was, for an individual that could barely speak English, he had an amazing ability to get people's confidence. I'll give you an example. He built this farm literally by himself, and he not only sold his potatoes, he started buying potatoes from all of the surrounding farms and processes them in his packing plant. And for a man who could barely speak English, this was remarkable. He could also not read or write English. Everything that he did, we had to translate for him. He was amazingly accomplished. He often told me, if I had your education, I could be president. I think that is probably true.
I'm kind of amazed at that. How does someone who came to the United States at 18, doesn't speak English, doesn't come with resources, doesn't read or write English, go to an area, I mean, Oregon at the time, I have to imagine, I mean, Oregon has an interesting history. And how does he come into a community where there's one other Chinese family and gain enough confidence of his neighbors to process their potatoes, and eventually is so prominent that at his 60th birthday, the mayors from 2 neighboring towns, a judge, a state senator come to his birthday? How does that happen?
He was amazingly resilient. He was very friendly. One of his closest friends owned the farm next door. His name was Hugh O'Connor. He was from Ireland. He had a thick Irish brogue, and these two got together and somehow communicated, and I couldn't understand either one of them. My father would have me translate some of what Mr. O'Connor was saying. It was an amazing relationship. When Hugh O'Connor finally decided that he was going to stop farming, he sold his farm to my father. That was just one of the relationships that my father had. I'll tell you one other one. We were not Catholic. But when I went to the Catholic grammar school, I went to my father and said, can we be baptized? And miraculously enough, my father said yes. I'm not even sure he knew what it was. But we went to the baptism, and Monsignor Casey said, Sam, we have to give Ming a name of a saint. And my father said, what's wrong with Ming? I thought, oh, this is never going to happen. But my middle Chinese name is Wei. And so my father said, okay, as long as it begins with a W. So that's how I got William. But the more interesting part of it was my father had to select a set of godparents for the 3 of us. So he selected his good friends Jerry and Madge Ahern, also Irish, also from the old country. So Madge and Jerry Ahern became our godparents. So my father had that way of making lifelong friends with all of the neighbors in the Klamath Basin. So,
to stay in that time period for just a little bit longer, if you don't mind, your father certainly was resilient. There can be no other, that's a fact. But I'm sure, however, he experienced quite some things, in his adjustment as someone who immigrated at 18. Was he willing to share any of those challenges with you when you were growing up and you were home from your school?
Oh, he told me about his experiences whenever he wanted to teach me a lesson. So I remember him telling me about what he went through to impress upon me that the problem that I thought I was facing at the time was not all that big. So he was a wonderful teacher, but he wanted to make sure that education was at the top of our list. And he would tell me, if you don't want to go through what I went through, then start studying. So we paid attention to that.
Are there any anecdotes from him that stand out that that helped you internalize that lesson?
One of them was during Prohibition. Apparently, they let all the alcohol into the stream. It wasn't his, it was the neighbors somehow. So apparently the fish got drunk. Now, I don't know if this really happened, but he would tell that story, that he just went out and picked up the fish for dinner, and he said they were really tasty.
So for those of you who went off to boarding school, and I believe you said it was you and your brother Tom?
My brother Tom and my sister Jeannie.
I see. And so you and Tom and Jeannie must have been very close.
We were. We were the Three Musketeers. And we did everything together. And it seemed like we had about 6 parents, because our older brothers and sisters were always watching out for us, always taking care of us. I was always so grateful to have so many different parents looking over us.
And it was you and Tom that moved down to the Bay Area for high school?
We went to Bellarmine. Jeannie stayed at Sacred Heart through high school and then came down to Cal when she went to college. And my brother Tom went to Cal after he graduated from Bellarmine.
So tell me about the move to Bellarmine. You had spent most of your schooling in a single school in a community in Oregon. It must have been quite a change to go to Bellarmine.
It really wasn't, because at Bellarmine we got a classical education. I took Greek and Latin, but I had gone to even though it was a kind of a rural Catholic grammar school, it was quite heavy in classics. So it was also heavy in arts and music. I mean, I took piano lessons. We had art lessons. The nuns were incredible teachers, and they brought all 3 of us along in this kind of classic Western civilization education. So stepping into a place like Bellarmine, even though it was different in the sense it was in a metropolitan community, the studying was similar to what I had just gone through with the Sisters of St. Francis. Only now I had the Jesuits in charge of my education. But the Bellarmine experience was an incredible education for a young 13-year-old from Klamath Falls, Oregon. But I had my brother there, so it was not a big problem adapting to the new situation. Even though we were a long ways away from home, we took the train down to Bellarmine, so it was a good experience.
And what was it like being so many miles distant from your 6 parents? That
was initially very hard, but we got used to it. We had to be resilient, and we had to be resourceful. But both of us threw ourselves into the studying that was required to get through a place like Bellarmine. So it was a good experience. And I still have lifelong friends from Bellarmine that I made while I was there. I just got admitted to something called the Bellarmine Hall of Fame. So 2 of my high school classmates and friends attended, and one of them was the son of Justice Ray Sullivan. Ray was on this court, not while I was here, but he was on the Court of Appeal downstairs, and then on the Supreme Court. And Raymond Larry Sullivan was a friend of mine in high school. And we were also friends. He also went to USF and then went on to medical school at UCSF. So when Ray Sullivan died, we always have a memorial service. It's an open session of the court, so we had one for Justice Sullivan. So Larry and his 3 sisters came to the memorial, so I invited them into my chambers here. And Larry walked in and said, "This was my father's chambers." But it was only half, because when we redid the building, somehow they gave us the size of 2 chambers. So he said, "I don't know which half it was, but one of these was my father's chambers."
Well, congratulations on being inducted. And you went from Bellarmine to another Jesuit school, University of San Francisco.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, I applied to lots of different schools, but I really wanted to stay with the Jesuits because I thought that the education that they gave me at Bellarmine was exactly what I needed. The other choice was Santa Clara, but I really wanted to come to San Francisco. And a friend of mine who also lived with Judge Vandenberg at the same time. He was in high school when I was in junior high school. His name was Tom Hawkins, and Tom was at USF. So I met with him, and I came up and had dinner with him, and really liked USF, and decided that that was where I wanted to go.
And was it at USF that you decided in your mind that you would go to law school and practice?
Yes, I had decided that this was something that I really wanted to do. So I set out laying the groundwork, and I eventually ended up at the USF Law School. Even though I was admitted to Bolt and to Hastings and to the University of Oregon, I decided to go to USF because they gave me a scholarship.
And one of, I believe, the commentators in the Bellarmine induction video talked about how active you were in student life at USF. You were active in student government. You were active in Greek life, you were active in social life. Can you describe your time at USF in college, and what motivated you to be so active?
I made a lot of good friends. I think some 30 out of my class at Bellarmine. I ended up at USF, and we are still friends today. My freshman year, I decided to run for freshman class representative. I won, so I was active in student government. I worked on the yearbook when I was at Bellarmine, so when I got to USF, I worked on the yearbook, and I worked on it with a man by the name of Tom Mellon. Tom was the editor our junior year, and I was the editor during our senior year. And just to tell you something about Tom, when I applied to the Alameda County District Attorney's Office for a law clerk position when I was in the second year at USF, I listed on my resume Tom Mellon Sr., who was Tom's father. When I interviewed with the deputy district attorney, he made a comment to me. He said, "I recommend you have Mr. Mellon call Mr. Coakley, who was the DA." I had no idea why, But I did, and Tom made the call. And I later found out that Tom Mellon was the campaign manager for Earl Warren when he ran for governor and when he ran for president. And of course, you know that Earl Warren was the DA of Alameda County. And I thought all this was based on merit.
I have to imagine that many of the attorneys who are watching this video might be younger. And often the statistics show that APIs, Asian Pacific Americans who go to law school, they tend to be the first in their family to go to law school. So, and often first in their family go to college, and often without the benefit of having people in their community who who are lawyers or have that experience. Is there anything that you'd be willing to share about kind of the importance of establishing a network of supporters, people who've been there, kind of getting that, finding ways to find mentors?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that there is any one formula. But what I can say is really important is that as you go through this process, it is important to keep contacts with people and good friends. I mean, I have made friends through the entire process, and they're still good friends. It is important to keep those contacts, not because you think they're going to help you, but because you like them, you care about them, you care about their families. With Tom Mellon, we just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a 5-day stay with Tom and his family down at Pebble Beach. We have maintained those friendships through all that we have gone through over the years. Those friendships have proved invaluable, not because Tom's father helped me get a job back in the DA's office, but because Tom and I and our families are good friends. Those contacts are invaluable, and you never know. You never know where the help is going to come from. So it is so important to maintain those friendships throughout all your life. I've certainly done that. It's been immensely rewarding because of the friendships, not because of what you think they might be able to do for you.
In law school, did you decide that you would start out in criminal practice? In other words, how firm was it fixed in your mind what your path would be?
I loved moot court. I loved criminal law. Back then we had very few electives, but I actually took a criminal law elective from a public defender. Owen Woodruff was the professor, and he actually had us prepare a trial notebook. And this was after I had clerked in the DA's office, so I started preparing my trial notebook from the work that I did in the DA's office. Judge Woodruff later told me that he took my trial notebook to a conference to show them the kind of work that his students were doing. And he said, oh, everyone does this. So he was quite impressed with my trial notebook, and I was impressed with the class that he taught, because he took us down. He was in the public defender's office here in San Francisco. He took us down to the trials. We got to observe him in action. It was a great experience. So I knew I wanted to be a trial lawyer, but when I graduated from law school, I knew that the law would have to wait, because I went through ROTC and I had to serve in the Army for 2 years. So I ended up in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, I got a letter from Frank Coakley, who was the DA of Alameda County, and Frank said, Ming, when you finish your tour of duty, you have a job here in the Alameda County DA's office. What a blessing that was, because it's really hard to interview when you're in the jungle. So unfortunately, by the time I got out of the Army, Frank Coakley retired. I said, now what do I do? So I called his fortunately Lowell Jensen was appointed to replace him. I called Lowell, he said come on in. I talked to Lowell in his office and told him about Frank's offer. He said, of course we'll keep the commitment. So I started in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office.
So you served your 2 years in the Army right after law school?
Yes. I spent, I was at Fort Benjamin Harrison, and then Fort Lewis, Washington, and then Fort Carson, Colorado. My unit in Fort Carson was activated as a unit to go to Vietnam. That meant that we had to prepare 5,000 men and 2,000 vehicles to move from Fort Carson, Colorado to a place called Quang Tri, Vietnam. That's 7 miles below the DMZ. We did that, and we were operational within 5 days. In most situations, we would still be looking for our toothbrush, but this was an incredible move, and it gave me great respect for the logistics and organization of the military. And I now know why the military requires you do something over and over and over again until you're sick of it, because when you really have to do it when it counts, if you have had that background and experience, it goes off without a hitch. And I gained great respect for the military and my experience working with outstanding young men from throughout the country that were just kind of thrown together in this unit and had to come together and put things together and in order very quickly in Vietnam.
Good experience for becoming a trial lawyer.
Absolutely, because you have to pay attention to the details, and you have to pay attention to what is right in front of you, and not always be planning for something down the road.
When you were relocated, I don't know the right phrase, from Fort Carson, Colorado to Quang Tri, Vietnam, 7 miles below the DMZ, was at a time of active combat?
Yes. Well, when we landed in Quang Tri, the pilot said the air base is under attack. So we are going to land, open up the rear of the airplane, and you are going, there's a tank in the middle of this airplane. So you are going to offload smartly and quickly, and we are going to take off.
What was that like?
Scary.
Did you, how long were you in Quang Tri?
6 months. I lived for 6 months in a tent. I haven't been camping since. But I moved from the 5th Division to the U.S. Army headquarters at Long Binh.
And what was your role there?
I was with the 1st Logistical Command, so I thought, this is really going to be great. I get to work in the U.S. Army headquarters, but it was much more exciting and challenging to work at the unit level, the brigade level. There is so much bureaucracy in a U.S. Army headquarters. It is mind-boggling. It was challenging, but it was not, you don't have the hands-on experience that you get when you're at the brigade level. And as I was going through this process of starting in the trial court and then going to the Court of Appeal and eventually ending up here, I thought, oh, I hope it's not like my Army experience. Because it would be awful to get to the California Supreme Court and say, oh, what have I done? I should have stayed on the trial court. Well, I fortunately did not have that experience. All of my experiences on the trial court in Alameda County and on the Court of Appeal downstairs and here at the Supreme Court have been incredible. And I would not have traded it for anything. But if I had to step back, I would not have left the 5th Division in Quang Tri, Vietnam. But that's all water under the bridge, and I'll live with it.
So you've had experience both at the unit level and the HQ level, both in the Army and in the courts.
Yes.
Did your experience at the unit level in the courts help inform what you do at the Court of Appeal and then later at the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. I'm glad I had the experience on the, first of all, I'm glad I had the trial experience as a lawyer, both as a DA and as a business trial lawyer. I loved being in the courtroom. It was, for me, the best part of being a lawyer. I know it isn't for everybody, but it was a challenge for me, and I loved it. I still have my trial notebooks on the shelf out here in the hallway. I won 2 cases in excess of $1 million, and that was worth a lot of money back then. And I still have both of those trial notebooks on the shelf.
Justice Chin, I wonder if you would be willing to describe what it was like to transition from active duty, having returned from Vietnam, to come back in civilian life.
The District Attorney's Office, fortunately, made it easy. It would have been awful to try to secure a legal position when you're in a foxhole. So I've always been grateful to Frank Coakley and Lowell Jensen for taking care of me during that part of my life. I know the transition was not easy for many of my friends and colleagues that I served with in Vietnam for lots of different reasons. When I had to give a speech at Golden Gate involving my service and being a veteran, I met a young man who eventually became my extern, and he had gone through some difficult times making the adjustment in getting out of the service. So I know what people have to go through, and I have a lot of empathy and sympathy for the people that go through those difficult times. I did not have to experience that, but I know a lot of my friends did. I tried to help them through it, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But it was a difficult time.
And I know that taking care of soldiers and veterans is something that's important to you. Was it your personal experience at the unit level and in Vietnam that made that important? Absolutely.
I think the veterans courts are doing a good job. The Swords to Plowshares is doing an incredible job of helping veterans through that difficult period. I am going to talk to a group of veterans later this year about some of what those people had to go through.
When you were in grade school and living with Judge David Vandenberg, you had the opportunity to see a trial and then also to, I have to imagine, talk to the judge about what that was like, and then even review law books and hold a piece of evidence in your hands. Can you describe what it was like when you first tried a case yourself as a young DA in Alameda County?
I was petrified. I thought, I am going to have to stand up in front of all these people and convince them of the value of my case. The first trial, I was scared to death. The second one, a little less scared. The third one, by the time I got to number 50, I was feeling pretty comfortable in the courtroom. But boy, the beginning was sure hard. You just have to push through it. You can tell yourself you can do it. I eventually felt very comfortable in a courtroom, but it was not easy. First of all, there were very few Asian trial lawyers. There were very few, there were almost no Asian judges. You just have to tell yourself you can do it, put your head down, work hard, be better prepared than anyone else in the courtroom, and it'll turn out all right. But it takes a lot of hard work.
Some of the viewers of this video might be coming into practice outside of California or Northern California. Personally, I grew up in areas of Michigan where there weren't a lot of Asian Americans around, which is probably why I'm interested in this work. But what can you tell them, having gone through this yourself, where let's say you're starting out your practice or you're doing your first trial and you're the only Asian around, and there are no Asian trial lawyers, no Asian judges. You have to believe that you can do it yourself. Any advice that you be willing to share?
I think that hard work is the key. I said before that you have to be better prepared than anyone else in the courtroom. That was particularly true when I was the only Asian face. I had to convince everyone else in that atmosphere at that particular time that I could do it and that I knew what I was talking about. And I could only do that if I was better prepared. I remember doing the arbitration in LA, and I had what was virtually a photographic memory. I could remember whole conversations. Some of them were important, some of them were not. But in an arbitration, you don't have a recorder. So I had to remember what every witness said. I had to know what every document said. And that memory of conversations was really helpful, because after a 6 weeks arbitration, it's hard to remember what happened in week 2 or week 3 or week 4. So I asked my witnesses who testified in the arbitration what they remember, and I eventually went with what I remembered, and it turned out to be right, and it sold the arbitration panel. That was the arbitration where my client was sued for $1.2 million. I cross-complained for $1.2 million. A plaintiff got nothing, and my client got $1.2 million. I said, it's time for me to retire because it's not going to get any better than this.
That's quite a result.
Well, it was time to retire because it wasn't going to get any better.
How long did you spend in the DA's office before you moved to private practice?
About 3 years.
And in 3 years, you did 50 trials.
Yes.
That's amazing. Is there anything that you can say to civil litigators today in an era where 98-99% of cases settle before trial?
Cases settled because they know you're ready. And that's where you have to direct your attention. Again, make sure that you know your case backwards and forwards and can express it to the other side so that they know where you're coming from. That's the best way to get a good settlement for your client. Being able to evaluate the value of your case accurately and not go into it with an inflated idea of what it's worth, because the people that you deal with in settling that case, regardless of whether or not it's JAMS or ADR or any other mediator, they're going to be able to look at that case and see through any inflation that you built in. So you've got to be able to realistically evaluate what your case is about. In order to do that, you've got to evaluate how your witnesses are going to come across to any trier of fact. So those aspects of the case are going to be paramount in your ability to get the best possible result for your client.
You have, in your career, engaged in a lot of different areas of the law. Criminal, civil, even within civil, became such an expert in certain topic areas like employment law and DNA that your writings still help teach other lawyers in California and around the world. How have you come to really master so many different areas of law?
That is a result of intellectual curiosity, not being afraid to tackle a subject with which you are not familiar. I'll give you an example. When I was appointed to the trial court, Mike Bellacci was the presiding judge in Alameda County, and Mike came to me and we were good friends. He said, "Ming, what area of the law do you know least about?" I went through the trials in the DA's office. I tried every kind of criminal case imaginable. In the business litigation side, I tried every kind of civil case imaginable. Securities, commodities, employment law, construction law. I said, "Mike, the only area that I have never practiced in is family law." He said, "Ming, guess where you're going to be assigned?" So I was assigned to family law. And the worst part of it was, he said, on Monday, the advanced family law class starts. It's only taught once a year. If you don't go Monday, you can't, you'll be in family law for a year without having gone through the advanced family law class. But I had to learn family law from zero to what I was going to be thrown into very shortly. I eventually taught family law. I mean, if you had told me 10 years before that I was going to be teaching family law in law school, I would have said, "Are you kidding me?" But I did that, but it was just an example of the kind of challenge that's thrown in front of you. When I was on the Court of Appeal, a DNA case arrived on my desk. I did not know anything about DNA. I had to learn it from zero, and eventually taught it in California, throughout the country, and even in Thailand and in China and in Mexico. So you never know what area of the law and expertise is going to be required of you. But when the case comes in front of you, dive in, learn it, and eventually master it, and then write a book. It's quite easy if you're intellectually curious.
I've seen elsewhere in your interviews where you said that your philosophy is constant improvement. What do you mean by that?
Do everything today better than you did it yesterday. If you do that, you will constantly improve the work product that is going out. It's a really simple concept, but an important one, I think, for young attorneys in particular to pay attention to. Do the very best job you can on the work that is right in front of you, and then move on to the next one and the next one, and make sure that each time you take a step that you are doing it better than you did the last time you had that a matter like that in front of you.
And how did you come to develop that philosophy?
I think it was probably from my father. He would organize the irrigation system so that it was virtually running on its own. And that was a complicated process to manage. But he would have the whole field running by itself, and then he'd go take a nap. Well, I tried it once, only I was reading a book. I set it all up, and I was actually reading a book, a biography of Lincoln, and I got it all set up the way he told me, and I sat down and I read the book. Well, I didn't quite have it mastered because the whole field got flooded, and my father came back, and I still remember the voice that he was shouting at me, but he never told me to stop reading. But I did learn that one lesson from it. Do it better the next time so that the field doesn't flood. So I really think I got it from Dad many, many years ago.
And your dad immigrated from a small village in Canton, and your mother too. Didn't have an opportunity for formal education. Why did he value formal education so much for you and your brothers and sisters?
Because he knew that with education, the sky was the limit. Now, he didn't learn English, but he did read and write Chinese. And I don't even know how he learned it because he didn't have any education in China. But he would get the Chinese newspaper delivered to the farm through the mail every day. He read that newspaper from cover to cover. I remember he would have conversations with Judge Vandenberg and Senator Boyven about current affairs. I could never understand where he got this information from, and now I realize he was reading the Chinese newspaper, and he kept up on all the current affairs. He would have arguments with Judge Vandenberg about whether Truman was right or wrong in firing MacArthur. I didn't even know he knew who MacArthur was, but it was a remarkable experience growing up under this man's guidance. Even though he had no formal education, he was one of the smartest men I've ever known.
You practiced as a DA for 3 years and in civil practice for 16, is that right? And then you were elevated to the bench.
Yes.
And how did that come about? Is there anything you can share about your path?
Well, the Asian American Bar was instrumental. Mike Lee was the president, and Mike is the one that suggested that I put my application in for the bench. I think Mike may have even been the one that gave me the PDQ, the personal data questionnaire that I had to fill out to do it. Marv Baxter was the appointment secretary for Governor Deukmejian. Marv now tells me that I was playing hard to get. I wasn't, because Marv says he was hinting to me that I should put my name in for the bench. Well, if you know Marv Baxter, this is not somebody you want to play poker with, because you get no information from Marv about any hint that he wanted me to put my name in for the bench. Marv says that I told him that I was in line to become president of the Alameda County Bar Association. There has never been an Asian. I want to do that. And he said, okay. So I waited until I was halfway through my term as president of the Bar Association to put my name in for the Alameda County Superior Court. I remember when I put my name in, I told Bob Friedman, who was then my vice president of the bar, and Bob said, I said, Bob, I put my name in for the bench. Bob said, I'm going to call every favor I have in Sacramento, and you will not be appointed until you finish your term as president. I finished my term on December 31st. I was appointed on January 8th. I called Bob and said, I have new respect for your power in Sacramento. When I went up for the interview with Marv Baxter, his office is right next to the governor's. I went in, he had this big binder in front of him. He started asking me questions. About 10 minutes into the interview, he slams the binder shut and he says, I can't do this anymore. I was ready to stand up and tell him how nice it was to see him again. He said, he got this big grin on his face, and he said, the governor has already approved your appointment. I'm just going through the motions. We then spent the next hour talking about farming, because he grew up on a farm in Fowler, south of Fresno, and I grew up on the potato farm in Klamath Falls. It is incredible how everything just sort of comes together. When Marv and I were growing up on these farms, he had a pet pony named Tony, and I had a 4-H calf named Tony. He spent 7 days a week, 24 hours a day working on the farm, and I did that in Oregon. Years later, we both find ourselves on the California Supreme Court. When I found out about Jason's appointment to the bench, my wife Carol and I were on a cruise in the Mediterranean with Marv and Jane Baxter, the same man that told me I was going to be a judge. So it's amazing how things turned out. And again, it's those friendships you form throughout all of this process. They're so important. So we did a lot of celebrating on that cruise of Jason's appointment.
Mike Lee was one of the early presidents of the Asian American Bar Association. How did it come to be that Mike encouraged you and that AABA helped in that process?
Well, Mike kept telling me that I had all of the criminal and civil experience that would be attractive to the governor and the appointment secretary. And he said, and by the way, we need more Asian Americans on the bench, so you have to take one for the group. Well, it was a big chore, but I was happy to take one for the group. Mike was incredibly encouraging, and it was important because I didn't know a lot about the process. I learned it rather quickly, but it was the Asian bar that, even though the Asian bar was very new, it was the Asian bar that was encouraging me to do this. So I am grateful.
Were you a member at the time?
Yes, of course.
At the celebration of 100 APA judges on Friday, you mentioned that you felt like a bookend, that you were one end of the bookend and that your son Jason, with his recent appointment, was the other end. Can you describe what that moment felt like when you found out that Jason had been appointed?
Incredible pride. I've always known that Jason was a fine attorney. As a matter of fact, when he was in the middle of a jury trial, I called him and said, "So Jason, how do you like trying cases?" He said, "Dad, I love it." That's what you always want to hear from your son. This is not something I pushed him into. It was his choice. But I was glad not only that he was good at it, but he loved the work. I'm also happy to report that he also loves being a judge. He's incredibly good at it. His staff loves him. He loves the work, so I'm glad he's still happy.
Your daughter also decided to follow you into the practice of law. Did you encourage her? I know you said that you didn't push Jason to the law, but did you encourage your daughter to practice?
I did not push either one of them. I'm happy to report. I was kind of surprised that they both decided to become lawyers or go to law school, and I told each of them, I recommend before you start law school that you take a year off and do whatever you want. They both work for law firms. They both had good experiences. And they both decided that they, wanted to go to law school. I'm happy to report that they're both happy in the law, and I'm incredibly proud of both of them. Jennifer actually followed in my interest in employment law. She practiced employment law with Thielen, Reed and Priest, then with the Oakland City Attorney's Office, and now as in the General Counsel's Office for the University of California.
The practice of law has changed quite a bit since you first joined the DA's office and then later joined private practice. It's changed in many different respects. There's been a consolidation in private practice, where large firms tend to proliferate. Medium-sized firms have, for the most part, gone away. There's a lot of economic pressure in the private practice of law, where billable hours, there are very high expectations for young attorneys starting out in these law firms. The system of trials in civil law have virtually disappeared. And you're lucky to find a trial lawyer who says he's a trial lawyer but has more than 10 trials. And now we're entering an era where computers are doing a lot of the work that young associates used to do. I know you have grandchildren. If they were at that point, when they get to that point where they're thinking about their paths in their careers and what to choose, would you recommend the law?
I think it would depend on what they want. I realize that technology has changed the practice of law. Well, technology has changed the way this court operates, fortunately. because we are going to electronic records. We are going to electronic filing. It is something that I think is really important for the courts to get more efficient. And we are doing that. And I think the result is that we're doing our work processing a lot more efficiently. Now, how this affects the practice of law, I hope is a positive one rather than a negative one. There is a book called Left Brain Thinking People Will Rule the World. And his theory is that right brain people who think in algorithms, doing things that are a continually repeat, will be done by computers. And the people with imaginations, the left brain thinking people, will rule the world. Now, whether or not that comes to pass, I think it may have already come to pass. But if you're talking about your children going into one practice or the other, I would not recommend that they go into the paralegal profession where they're doing the things that are redundant and the same thing is done over and over and over and over again, because those tasks are going to be done by computers. So now, if I had this conversation with one of my grandchildren, their eyes would glaze over and they would say, what are you talking about? But I think those are some of the kinds of conversations you might have to have before you recommend that a grandchild go into a particular field, because you have to look to see what is going to happen in that field because of technology. I think lawyers will always be necessary, because you will have to have people who can use that left brain imagination and come up with something that is not a continually repeated motion.
I have a friend who started a AI company where the AI develops form pleadings, answers, affirmative defenses, even some responses to interrogatories and objections. So if we now have form discovery responses, form pleadings, how far away are we from AI doing fact-finding?
Well, I'll go one step further. How far are we from judges? So we can predict what the judges will do? There's an attorney, I don't know if you know him, Kurt Jenkins, who does algorithms. He analyzes judges' opinions. He thinks that he's going to be able to predict the result of a particular judge's opinion based upon the past decisions that that judge has made. I mean, talk about scary. We may be replaced. We won't need judges. But I think that your fact-finding question is an interesting one. Are based upon a particular fact situation, are they going to be able to predict what the result will be? So who knows where this is going to end? I find technology really exciting. I know not everyone does, but I have been pushing the courts for many years to take advantage of all of the technology that is out there. Video appearances, witnesses testifying by video. We should get people out of the line waiting to get into the courtroom and online doing their legal business. People don't want to come down to court for a traffic ticket, wait 3 hours, get in for 10 minutes to see the judge. Why aren't we doing that online? We should be getting, we should not require people to leave their jobs, go wait at the courthouse for 3 hours for some appearance. We should not require attorneys to come out of their offices where they're doing productive work and come down and wait outside the courtroom for 3 hours. So I think there's a lot that judges and courts can do to streamline this process and get people out of lines and doing their work online.
As we experience these changes in the law, what is that nub, that core that technology should not replace?
Well, we've had a lot of discussions about artificial intelligence and how far it should go. There are a lot of books written on the subject. I think it's scary when you think that machines are going to replace people for a whole variety of reasons. You talk about robots putting cars together. You talk about robots in factories. I think, as I said before, that all of the things that are repeat functions are going to be done by artificial intelligence. So as far as I'm concerned, I think that's a good thing. And you can get people to do really important things. But I may be in a minority because so much of what people are working on now are repeat functions. And if we keep going down this road of artificial intelligence taking over all of that, there are going to be a lot of people out of work.
And what do we do about those people?
There's got to be a balance. Retraining. People have to be able to be resilient and adapt to new situations rather than doing the same thing over and over and over again, which is really boring anyway. But there's got to be a balance, because you can't be throwing all these people out of work and then have chaos. So we've got to do it carefully.
I wonder if there's a limit to retraining. I read a statistic somewhere that said that the most common occupation is driving of one sort or another. And we've already seen the impact of applications on driving professions like taxi cabs. And pretty soon, one of these companies, whether it's Tesla or Google or Apple, will take over the driving function. And I wonder if there's a limit.
If they haven't already.
If they haven't already, right.
But, I keep thinking, would I want to be in a car that's driving itself? Well, maybe, rather than the drunk next door driving the car, or the guy on his cell phone driving the car, or doing any number of things that they shouldn't be doing. Maybe I'd rather have a computer driving the car. But there's got to be a balance, and you can't be marching down this road and not being able to. You have to be able to predict how many people are going to be out of this particular job, and what are you going to do to get them into new jobs. Talk about being resilient. They're going to have to really be resilient.
And having experienced both ends of the bookends, as you described, if I could ask a philosophical question, and since you've served in so many different roles as a farmer, as an active duty combat, as in the district attorney's office, private practice, unit level in the court system, intermediate court of appeal, and now the Supreme Court, and where you're now observing your son as he takes the bench. What makes for a meaningful practice as a lawyer?
I would say that I would combine the two: a meaningful practice as a lawyer and a meaningful career as a judge. I think both of them depend on your being able to help people solve whatever particular problem they have at that particular time. That is an incredible responsibility. Whether you're representing a multi-million-dollar corporation or whether you're representing the little old lady down the street, you're helping them solve a problem. I had that experience in family law. Almost everyone that I've talked to hated their experience in family law. I loved it because I was able to help people at the worst possible time in their life. I remember I was asked to do a town hall meeting in Hayward, and it was my responsibility. I was sitting in family law. It was my responsibility to answer all the family law questions. I did that, and I thought before I did it, I thought this is a terrible idea because everyone who just had their case heard by me in family law is going to come in and want to relitigate that case. That didn't happen. All of the questions were really quite reasonable, and time was up. People still had their hands up. They wanted to ask questions. I said, I realize that our time is up and I don't want to hold the entire audience, but I will stay here as long as you want to answer those of you who have additional questions. This lady came marching up to the table and said, Judge Chin, you handled my divorce. I said, here it comes. She said, I want you to know that when you calmly invited my former husband and I up to the bench and told us very calmly that we should stop fighting over the property and think about how you are together going to raise your son for the next 18 years. She said, a light bulb went off in both of our heads, and I want you to know that we paid attention and we are doing it, and thank you. I thought, how much more rewarding can it be to sit all day in a family law court where people are yelling and screaming at each other, the children are hollering, to finally hear that through all of that chaos, somebody listened and you helped somebody. I think that lawyers and judges who have that experience, it makes the practice worthwhile. It makes judging worthwhile. And if we keep that in perspective as you're going through the trauma of each one of those problem-solving experiences, you'll find it really rewarding.
What I'm curious about, and what I think the audience might be curious about, is looking back on you and the different roles that you've served, and just your life in general. You've had so many different experiences. What makes for a meaningful and rewarding life?
Oh, that's a heavy question. Well, for me, it's family. Regardless of the success I've had as a lawyer, as a judge, the most rewarding part of this whole experience is family. And that's why I was so elated when Jason got appointed as a judge. I turned to my wife and I said, we did a good job. And nothing else can match the feelings that you get when you look at your children and grandchildren and say, look what we've created. There's nothing better than that for me. I think my wife would say the same thing. And she's been such an incredible partner through all of this. It wasn't always easy. We had to muscle through some difficult experiences, but I think she will tell you that looking at the family that we have and see how they're all intertwined and how they get along with each other and how they treat each other, that's the best part of this whole experience.
Thank you, Justice Chin.
my pleasure.